Perfect. Thanks for having me. So today's project, or the paper I'm going to talk about today, is actually a bigger project that Christian and I are working on together. My name's Dustin Frye. I'm at Vassar. The program, I think, says I'm at Colorado, but I just finished the market this year and took a job. And I think, other than my mom, the only person more excited about that is Christian, because he now gets sort of a co-author back. I think he was patient enough to suffer with me while I was absent the last year or so. So this project, the title of it right now, and it's very much under construction, is sort of Assimilating Communal Ownership Cultures into an Individual Ownership Economy, Native Americans in the 1887 Dawes Act. And so this paper is broadly about kind of a reservation land privatization policy that was instituted between 1887 and 1934. And over this period of time and through this privatization, roughly about 65% of reservation land sort of moved out of Native ownership. We'll go into sort of in the following slides, we'll talk more about sort of the specifics of the policy and how it worked. But there was a lot of movement, a lot of change in ownership, where in 1887, roughly, there were about 138 million acres controlled sort of by reservations and tribes. And by the end of this period, when sort of this privatization policy was stopped, there was only about 48 million acres left. And so there's a fairly large shock and sort of disturbance to both the economy of reservations, but also sort of the social structure and the social arrangement of how sort of tribes were organized. One of the consequences, in some of the estimates, we don't have a great idea of sort of this number, but the most commonly used estimates suggest this created about 90,000 sort of landless Indians. And so individuals where you were given some degree of property initially that have kind of no ownership of land anymore. And so this is a pretty large shock to kind of Native communities. And the very broad question that we're looking at with this project is sort of what impact did this act have on development? And this, I should preface with this project's very, very sort of early stage. Some of that is because, we didn't make as much progress as I was sort of on the market, but also we're just sort of really feeling out sort of the best direction to push this paper. So we're really excited to kind of bring it here and get lots of feedback. And so all this feedback is welcome because we're kind of early in this. So to understand this act a little bit more specifically, just because, we're not everybody's familiar with it, this act comes about, and the first sort of momentum comes about in the 1870s, and we start to have reformers following the Civil War. There's a lot more interest in westward expansion, movement to the west, and that's kind of, you're starting to get negative interactions with sort of Native Americans and tribes. And we've already placed a lot of Native Americans on reservations by this point or through this era. And the reformers in Washington begin targeting this idea of sort of allotting reservation lands and essentially privatizing sort of these communally owned lands and privatizing them into individually owned parcels and assigning them to households. And they really targeted this as a key element in sort of this broad assimilation strategy. So this was a big part of this, and the belief, when you read sort of historical accounts, it was almost this sort of religious belief that they thought that just the assignment of property rights on its own would have a massive effect in sort of converting and changing Native Americans to become sort of good Christian tax-paying farmers, right? And this was kind of the goal of this policy. And so they start approaching this in the 70s, and by 1887, Congress passes what's referred to as the General Allotment Act, and in here we'll call it the Dawes Act named after its sort of primary author. And this policy sort of begins in 1887, but is actually rolled out over about a 50-year period of time. And so we're going to actually exploit sort of this rollout over time. This is kind of an important feature for us, where each reservation at the discretion of the president was sort of opened for allotment. And what that meant is that At this point, reservations were going to have their sort of communal land parceled up into individual sort of 160-acre plots, so somewhat similar to like a Homestead Act style policy. The one key feature of this is that these allotments were placed in what they call a 25-year trust. And so essentially they couldn't be sort of leased or sold or sort of willed. You couldn't declare sort of who your heir was going to be for sort of a period of 25 years. And the idea here was to sort of slow down the sale of native land into sort of non-native ownership to avoid all the sort of new property owners from just immediately running and selling the land to sort of settlers. And this trust only expired sort of once the owner was declared sort of competent. And this competency will come into play when we start to think about kind of this process a little more in terms of who was in charge of kind of declaring competency. What's interesting about this is for individuals that actually were declared competent, that received their land, only between about 10 and 20% actually kept all the land over this period. So another feature of the Dawes Act is the excess land. And so any land, so they're taking a reservation, they're dividing it into these small 160-acre parcels and assigning them to households. So any land that doesn't get assigned to households, for example, if you had a 1 million-acre reservation and 500,000 acres were sort of allotted into parcels, the remaining 500,000 acres was declared surplus and was open to sale to homesteaders. And so of that roughly 90 million acres, about 60 million were in this sort of surplus category. And so this was sort of a big feature of this policy, and obviously, land grabbing and homesteaders were very, very excited about the prospects of these surplus lands. And so actually implementing Dawes on the ground is kind of the feature of this paper that we're really interested in sort of exploiting and understanding a little bit more. And so from what we've read, Indian agents, sort of these agents that were responsible for sort of a set of reservations, were largely in charge of sort of enacting this policy and implementing this act. And they had sort of a series or kind of a set of different actions. So initially they were there to sort of oversee the surveying, oversee sort of the assignment of plots, and really help kind of just assigning plots to individuals. They also were in charge of this competency issue. And so they were sort of the leader in terms of they would determine when a Native American was declared competent and essentially when you would receive title to the land. So they had quite a bit of power, and then they also managed the surplus lands, so declaring sort of when the surplus land was going to be made available for sale. And they were really in charge of kind of how this land was really moving and changing sort of throughout this Dawes period. And so these agents are a really important part of this process, and we're going to come back to these agents and sort of they become a key feature of our empirical strategy a little bit later. So how the Dawes Act was kind of the process worked is initially from the president or from basically the executive branch, a reservation was declared open for allotment. And over time, right, not necessarily immediately, but sort of over time, they would begin surveying and assigning sort of property rights or assigning these plots. And so each household was essentially given this 160 acres. If you didn't sort of line up to accept your land, they just gave you one anyway, right? And from there, through this process, we're essentially taking this communal reservation land, and it becomes categorized in what we call sort of individual trust land. So it's placed in this 25-year trust. And then over some time, after some time has passed, right, initially this 25-year window, that is actually later relaxed with another sort of act of Congress, but you were able to apply for what we call this patent and fee, which is essentially you were able to apply for sort of the fee simple title, which means you could actually own the land outright. And it's at this point where the owner was able to sell the land or sort of have some land transaction. Okay? So now that we've kind of laid out a little bit of sort of the background of this act, we're going to we have sort of very broad kind of goals and objectives in terms of understanding the effect of this policy on reservations. What I think is unique about our approach is that we're really interested in, and with the data we have, we're able to comment on both sort of the historic implications and also kind of the current implications of this act. So and we'll talk a lot about the data collection effort that we've gone through to put together some really rich and nice historic data that allows us to understand sort of this process as it's rolling out, and to understand a lot more about how this is working on the ground, sort of what the short-term implications are. And then also we have some access to data that allows us to understand a little bit more about the long term. Our questions then, kind of we're working on defining sort of more specific questions after that. But in our first order question is really understanding the impact of DAWs just on land ownership itself. We have, I think, some broad understanding. There's some sort of these large statistics that we started with and that we kind of use to motivate the importance of this project. But we really want to understand sort of at a much smaller level, how was the DAWS Act being applied to reservations, and what impact does it have kind of at the local level? And how do we get between this 138 million to the 48 million, right? How does this process work? And sort of establish, and contribute in that sense. And then sort of once we establish that, then sort of the follow-up questions are thinking a lot about sort of the local economic conditions, right? Both during implementation and sort of what legacy does this act leave behind in terms of the sort of the land tenure arrangement that is left in its wake. Because it sort of, in 1934, essentially time freezes for sort of Native American reservations in terms of the property right structure. And there's a lot of work sort of looking at sort of this freeze, and we're hoping to contribute into that sort of the legacy of the DAWS Act literature as well, but also being able to connect through time sort of the historic kind of what was happening early in history to sort of what we see today, and be able to kind of bridge a gap that presently we don't really have much understanding about. And then the last question that I think we're able to get at is to really start to understand more about sort of off-reservation activity, right? What impact did DAWS have for migration? At the time that DAWS is instituted, most Native Americans in the US were living sort of on the reservation or very, very close by. And now what we see is that about 60% of Native Americans, I think this is according to the recent censuses, actually are living away from the reservation. And so understanding, when we see this number with 90,000 landless Indians, and we see there's this big shock in terms of sort of, were people moving in with family, and we have changes to family structures and sort of traditional families change. And then do we also get lots of sort of out-migration away from reservations, and sort of what implications did that have? Does it have for sort of the selection into who remains on reservations? And some of these sort of similar questions, maybe even related to what Donna was talking about earlier, right? About sort of selection and migration issues. And so these are some of the, and still very broad questions that we're picking through. So thinking about the data, so this is really kind of sets up where this paper is at, and where most of our effort has gone over the last year is putting together and sort of bringing together a bunch of different data sources. And I think one of the large contributions of this paper and the project has really been trying to organize a bunch of both historical and contemporary data and weave it together. And so one series that we have is some individual level micro data from 1900 and 1910 that we use and that we're able to bring in to understand some of what was happening historically at the time. And so this is a 5% sample of sort of all Native Americans. And one feature of this data that is useful is that it contains both information on location and tribal affiliation. And so with that, this is what allows us to look at questions about migration, to look at mobility, and to try to understand sort of at the time what kind of sort of push factors, if we think about Dawes as a push factor sort of moving people away from the reservation, do we see that? And then, do we see sort of the necessary, or the chain migration that maybe follows? And so having the location information is going to be really important for understanding sort of migration patterns and being able to sort of assign people to reservations. And with this, it gives us a fair degree of flexibility in terms of the type of outcomes that we can look at here, where there's information. The historical censuses are pretty good for information on employment, education and literacy, and also family structure. So I mentioned this idea of these 90,000 landless Indians and sort of, do you just have to move in, right? You sort of think of everybody now has this uncle that now lives with you, right? And this sort of permanent uncle that sort of, is maybe living and being supported by the family. And what sort of, traditions do you develop in terms of how sort of families are organized? And so the first piece of data, historical data, is going to be to use and exploit some of this historical microdata. The biggest part of our data collection effort right now is focusing on sort of these Bureau of Indian Affairs annual reports. And so so these reports they're fairly rich, and this is annual reports. They were produced every year. They're produced before 1860, but we're really collecting from about 1860 to sort of the mid-1930s. And it has reservation and agency level information. It also has a lot of detailed letters which allow us to learn a lot about sort of what was happening on the ground at the time, sort of at the reservation level. And so we can chart this out historically to really understand a lot of important information. And primarily for our purposes, this contains a lot of allotment information. So it tells us a lot about sort of the process. This is where we were going to learn more about sort of the process of land moving from sort of reservation status to this individual, sort of this individual trust land, but also from trust land into sort of privately held land and into maybe sort of settler-owned land or ownership that way. Another feature within this is there's a lot of information about sort of these Indian agents, and so these people played an important role in this process. And so we're going to be able to actually look at their letters and collect information both about the agent and also sort of look at what they're telling us. And then within these reports, they also give some broad economic data, things about agriculture, livestock, timber production. There's some measures of per capita income. So there's a lot of sort of rich information here that we've been collecting. So here's just one snapshot of some of what we have to work with. So we can see sort of within a reservation, it gives us some information about sort of the allotment process. Right? So if we look at the Southern Utes in Colorado, we know something about how long it took for the land to be allotted. We know something about sort of the assignment of land in terms of how many acres were moved. And then we have these similar reports to this over time. And so we're really able to sort of track this flow of land over time to understand sort of what was happening on the ground. Within this, we also have these, sort of a sample of the letters. And at the end of each letter, the agent, they were later known as superintendents, we sort of know their name, and this is going to be an important feature for identification purposes. As I mentioned, we're going to weave this in with contemporary data as well, and so one thing we have is through these the research data centers in the US, we have access to sort of the confidential microdata that dates back from 1970 into 2010, and this actually has a complete universe of Native Americans in the States. And with this, we again know sort of location information, tribal affiliation, and this allows us to then look at a lot of the similar outcomes that we were able to look at with the micro level data. And hopefully then we can make some connection between sort of what was happening historically to what was happening sort of currently. There's also good current reservation level data available that we're going to tie into through sort of, some different sort of reservation aggregates that allow us to sort of understand incomes, industry mixes, asset ownership, things like that. And finally, we'll weave in some sort of other measures, geographic data, understanding neighbors, making sure that we're making the proper comparisons to sort of the surrounding areas, but also be able to account for things like natural resources, the quality of land through these agro-suitability measures. And so we're going to, the big part of the focus up to this point and where we're at with this paper largely has been weaving all of these together and making them sort of useful. So moving a little bit and previewing a little bit of how we see this design, and again, this is very fluid at this point. We have sort of a very simple kind of fixed effects type setup in mind, where really we have kind of one of these outcomes of interest, and ultimately wanting to understand sort of how is DAWs or the imposition of these property rights affecting, this outcome, and so, a few things that that this model will likely include is sort of reservation level fixed effects, some understanding sort of these BIA region by year effects, to account for, to just reduce the comparison a little bit. We'll have some of the individual controls, and then likely our reservation errors will be clustered at the reservation level. But this is sort of a very simple and naive model because we're kind of faced with this issue that this DAWs treatment is kind of likely to be endogenous. And one reason we think this, so we sort of talked about this idea that the agents were largely responsible for what was happening on these reservations, and that they each had quite a bit of discretion in terms of how they approach these sort of each reservation. And you can imagine sort of an agent with a different set of beliefs about the importance of property rights. And so if you have a very aggressive agent who sort of always sees property rights as this incredible fix and that every reservation needs to have, we want to be able to sort of account for sort of differences with these agents. And one feature that we exploit, or there's actually two features we exploit with the nature of these agents. So the first is their mobility. So they typically move in very short intervals. Somewhere I think we'd read that the schedule or the plan was sort of an every 5-year move, and that they were sort of on some type of cycle, so that they were moved fairly frequently. So actually changed locations. So they would be posted in different locations. Serving as an agent sort of at different reservations. Sorry, I should be more clear about that. So that these agents are actually, in one instance, and I'll go through an example in a second where we look at some of this, sort of an example of this movement. But essentially they're moving from one reservation, they're in charge of one reservation, and then they move to another one, and they're in charge of that for a season as well. And there's a lot of sort of geographic variation in this mobility and in how much they move. And so this is really useful for us. And then also we exploit sort of the fact that they tend to behave very differently. And the plan at this point for this instrument, how we're going to use this, and this is a little bit sort of complicated, but for each period, so for any given year, what we're going to do for the DAWs treatment is we're going to instrument sort of how a reservation was treated or affected by DAWs in sort of time t with what was that agent's behavior like at their previous postings. Sort of how did that agent behave before? And this is going to essentially serve as sort of an instrument for kind of what would we expect them to do presently, okay? And so just to give kind of this example in my last couple minutes, so I tracked, so as we've been sort of taking samples and testing, is this idea going to work? Is this data collection effort worth sort of the time and money? We went and we moved through sort of the Blackfeet reservation. And we calculated and sort of tracked a bunch of data for the Blackfeet, and we found sort of F.C. Campbell was the agent. He was also the agent in the letter I showed earlier, not at the Blackfeet reservation, and actually not at the next reservation. He was posted sort of elsewhere. But we can look at sort of these eras, the sort of highlighted eras. This is where F.C. Campbell was serving as the sort of the agent in charge of the Blackfeet reservation. And so what we're interested in is sort of the treatment and implementation of DAWs sort of in these eras or in these periods where we see, the graph is showing sort of how much land is sort of being allotted, how much land is moving into sort of privately owned land. And we're going to basically use sort of F.C. Campbell's behavior when he was serving in sort of his prior post or one of his previous posts where he was here at the Cheyenne River Reservation. And so we would actually use sort of the behavior and what happens in this posting for what actually is implemented at the Blackfeet Reservation. Okay. So that's basically where this paper is kind of at. We're still very much in the data collection part of this paper. And so kind of in our upcoming work is really finalizing that, and then, then we'll work on writing the AER, right? But, we'll get this done sort of first. And I think that probably takes me about to the time that I had. So,